Welcome back to the series we're doing on the Consistory and Social Discipline in Calvin's Geneva. This is by Geoffrey Watt. We're now moving into chapter 2, which is the push for religious uniformity. And as we saw, or maybe you saw in the Muller series we've recently started, Calvin's theology had both academic clarity and pastoral consequence. So here we begin to see what it looked like on the ground. Sermons instead of sacraments, pastors instead of priests, and a consistory watching over things. And the first section is From Mass to Sermon. The Reformation in Geneva fundamentally reoriented worship. Once the Eucharist was celebrated daily in the Latin Mass, now the heart of the Christian life was the sermon. This is a quote from page 39, where Watt writes, "With the conversion to Reformed Protestantism, the sermon replaced communion. The pastor was dressed in a plain black robe rather than in the colorful vestments of priests and delivered the sermon in the vernacular," unquote. Calvin and his colleagues used this shift not only to educate, but to shape a civic rhythm, a culture of word-centered religion. Here's a quote from page 40. "Everyone was expected to go to church at least once on Sunday. The principal service was at 8 in the morning, and ideally more often," unquote. The next section is the consistory and its reach. The consistory was not just an advisory council. Geoffrey Watt describes it as having teeth. Though technically it couldn't issue civil penalties, but it could admonish, it could exclude from communion, and refer cases to the council. So maybe our modern vernacular would say they didn't have the power of negative sanctions. That was limited to the civil magistrate, but they did have the power of positive sanctions. This is a quote from page 7. "The consistory was an ecclesiastical institution that could not impose any secular penalties. If it deemed miscreants worthy of a secular penalty, it referred them to Geneva's small council." That was on page 7. Again, here on page 8, quote, "It did have one vitally important power, the right to excommunicate," unquote. What was most unique in Geneva compared to Zurich or Bern was that pastors, not magistrates, controlled the table. We take that for granted today, but in Geneva, that was a unique phenomenon. As Watt puts it, this is a quote from page 8, "Since the consistory eventually had the exclusive right to excommunicate in Geneva, the pastors of Geneva enjoyed a power that their counterparts in Zurich, Bern, and Basel did not have," unquote. The third section of chapter 2 is confronting heresy and relics of the past. While formal heresy cases like Bolsec or Servetus were rare and handled by the council, not the consistory, residual Catholicism was a daily battle, particularly among women. Prayers to the Virgin, celebration of saints' days, and mass attendance in Savoy remained quite common. On page 48, Watt writes, quote, "Calvin and his associates appeared especially concerned about the religious behavior of women, who were more likely than men to remain tied to various Catholic beliefs and practices," unquote. And on page 49, he writes, quote, "The consistory was wholly intolerant of anything that obliquely resembled the invocation of the Madonna, even in the most trying circumstances," unquote. The evidence is detailed. One woman declared she'd rather the devil take her child than baptize him without honoring St. Claude. That was an example on page 50. Others refused to work on Christmas Day. That's on page 51. These weren't theological arguments. They were just cultural instincts. I noted in the first chapter, though, you do have to be a little careful with Watt. His use of consistory records are rarely cited, and you're taking his translations at his word. If you translate the text, they're all available in French online. You translate themselves, you often find a very different picture of what's going on. The second, or rather the fourth segment of this chapter is pastoral leniency and then theological precision. And yet this wasn't a reign of terror. The consistory's ultimate goal was repentance and reintegration. On page 47, we read, "Calvin and the consistory's strong interest in reintegrating into the community people who had gone astray." And there's another quote here. Calvin warned against being too harsh. Discipline must in no case go beyond what the specific sin warranted. So it wasn't uncommon for offenders to be readmitted to communion within weeks of confessing and showing contrition. If you survey Calvin's view on allowing those excommunicated to return to the table, his standards, though believed to be very harsh and severe, were far more lenient than what you would see today. As a participant on presbytery committees to examine the repentance of those that have been excommunicated, I can speak from experience that Calvin would certainly have been deemed much more lenient. The fifth section to this chapter was social surveillance and bottom-up discipline. If Foucault imagined surveillance as a feature of the modern state, Geneva may have been a prototype, is Watt's conclusion, but it wasn't just top-down. This is a quote from the chapter. He says, Philip Gorski asserted that the Reformation unleashed a profound and far-reaching process of disciplining, deepest and most dramatic in the Calvinist parts of Europe, unquote. And this wasn't just by decree, it was enforced by neighbors, by congregants, and even by children. Again, there's a bit of bias when you read this chapter, but it is true that the entire congregation was involved, much like it might be today. One gets the impression Watt is not of the tradition, so this may seem entirely foreign to him. On page 63, there's a quote, the consistory depended on the residents of Geneva for information on those who were deviating from Calvinist mores, unquote. So a little bit more of Watt's bias. The discipline that was instituted in Geneva from the consistory was attributed to what he calls Calvinist mores, but that's to be substantiated, of course. On page 57, he writes, many residents felt it was their moral responsibility to rebuke blasphemers, even publicly, unquote. And there's really not much to substantiate most of the claims in this chapter, so one would do well to read the consistory records in conjunction with books like this. Closing reflection, what emerges in chapter 2 is not a cold bureaucratic system by Watt's analysis, but a reformed pastoral order. The sermon replaced the Mass, the consistory replaced the confessional, and repentance replaced penance. It's a bit simplistic, but that's Watt's conclusion, because again, the consistory wasn't a confessional in the sense that Roman Catholics practice confession by even any broad comparison. This is a quote on page 62. Calvin faithfully attended the meetings of the consistory, missing only when impeded by poor health or travel, essentially dedicating at least one day a week to exhort Genevans to forswear their wayward behavior, unquote. And that's chapter 2. In the next chapter, we'll see how this pastoral vision extended to the young, to catechism, to parenting, to education, and in the formation of a godly household. That will complete chapter 2. We'll see you next time.